It was upon an evening of uncommon stillness in the late autumn of that year that the singular events which I am now about to record first intruded themselves upon the ordered routine of our lives at Baker Street. The fog, which had for several days lain thick upon London, had at last lifted, leaving behind it a cold clarity that rendered every sound more distinct and every shadow more sharply defined. It was a night in which the senses seemed unnaturally alert, and perhaps it was for this reason that I became first aware of the circumstance which was to lead us into one of the most perplexing and deeply personal cases of my association with Sherlock Holmes. Holmes himself had been in one of his reflective moods throughout the day. Reclining in his armchair, with his long, thin fingers pressed together and his eyes half closed, he had given every appearance of a man detached from the world around him. Yet I knew from experience that beneath this apparent indolence his mind was engaged in those subtle processes of reasoning which so often yielded results of startling brilliance. For my own part, I had spent the afternoon in the perusal of certain medical journals, though I confess that my attention wandered more than once to the street below. There was, I thought, something in the air of tension, slight yet perceptible, which resisted easy explanation. It was shortly after dusk when I first observed it. I had risen from my chair and crossed to the window, intending no more than to draw the curtain against the growing chill. As I did so, my eye was caught by a movement upon the opposite side of the street. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the lamplight, its outline indistinct yet unmistakably human. There was nothing, at first glance, remarkable in this. Baker Street is no stranger to loiterers, nor is it unusual for passers-by to pause beneath the lamps. Yet something in the posture of the figure arrested my attention. It stood very still, too still, perhaps, and its head was turned in such a way that I could not help but feel that it was directed toward our very window. I remained there for some moments, watching. The figure did not move. At length I spoke. "Holmes," I said, "there is a man across the street who appears to be observing the house." Holmes did not open his eyes. "Indeed?" he murmured. "And what leads you to that conclusion, Watson?" "He has not moved for several minutes," I replied, "and his attention seems fixed upon this window." Holmes gave a faint smile. "My dear Watson," he said, "the mere act of standing still is not in itself suspicious. London contains many men who possess neither occupation nor urgency." "Perhaps," I said, "but I cannot rid myself of the impression that he watches us." Holmes opened his eyes then, and with a single fluid motion rose from his chair and joined me at the window. He did not look directly at the figure, but rather allowed his gaze to pass casually over the street, as though noting 100 insignificant details. "Ah," he said softly. "Yes, I see him. And what do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes was silent for a moment. "Nothing," he said at last. "At present." I turned to him in some surprise. "You do not consider it worthy of investigation?" I said. Holmes shrugged slightly. "Not unless the phenomenon persists," he replied. "A single observation is a curiosity. A repeated one becomes a pattern." With that he turned away and resumed his seat, as though the matter were of no further consequence. Yet I could not so easily dismiss it. I returned to the window more than once over the next quarter of an hour, but on each occasion the figure remained in place. It was only when I stepped away for a brief moment, no more than a minute, that the change occurred. When I looked again, the man was gone. I confess that I felt a curious sensation at this. There had been no sound of footsteps, no visible movement. One moment he had been there, and the next he had vanished as completely as though he had never existed. "Holmes," I said, "he has disappeared." Holmes glanced up. "So he has," he said calmly. "You observed his departure?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied, "but I anticipated it." I stared at him. "You anticipated that he would vanish?" I said. Holmes's eyes twinkled faintly. "My dear Watson," he said, "men who wish to be observed do not stand in shadows, and men who do not wish to be observed do not remain in one place for long." This explanation, though characteristic of Holmes, did little to ease my unease. Indeed, it was only later, when the events of that night had unfolded, that I realized how significant that first observation had been. The following morning brought with it a visitor whose arrival served to transform what might otherwise have remained a minor curiosity into a matter of grave importance. Mrs. Hudson entered our sitting-room shortly after breakfast, her expression one of unusual concern. "There is a gentleman below, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He is most anxious to see you." Holmes set aside his cup. "Show him up," he said. A moment later the door opened to admit a man whose appearance at once commanded attention. He was of middle height, with a pale, drawn face and eyes which darted nervously about the room, as though in search of something unseen. His clothing, though of good quality, was disordered, and there was about him an air of agitation which spoke of recent distress. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said. Holmes inclined his head. "At your service," he replied. The man stepped forward. "My name is Edward Halcombe," he said. "I have come to you because I am in fear for my life." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Pray be seated, Mr. Halcombe," he said. "You will find that fear is often diminished by explanation." Halcombe sat, though his eyes continued to move restlessly. "It is not explanation I lack," he said. "It is certainty." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then let us begin with facts," he said. "What is the nature of your danger?" Halcombe hesitated, then leaned forward. "I am being followed," he said. I felt a slight start at this, and could not help but glance toward the window. "Followed?" Holmes said. "By whom?" "That is precisely what I cannot determine," Halcombe replied. "I have seen no one clearly, yet I am certain that I am watched. Wherever I go there is something." Holmes's expression remained composed. "You have observed this presence directly?" he said. "Not directly," Halcombe admitted. "It is always at the edge of vision, a movement, a shadow, a figure that disappears when I turn to look. A chill passed through me." "And how long has this been occurring?" Holmes asked. "For 3 days," Halcombe said. "Since the night I returned from my office late." Holmes's eyes sharpened slightly. "Tell me everything," he said. Halcombe drew a breath. "I was walking home," he said, "when I first became aware of it. A sensation no more at first that I was not alone. I turned but saw nothing. Yet as I continued the feeling persisted, and then I glimpsed it." "What did you see?" I asked. Halcombe's voice dropped. "A figure," he said. "Behind me. It was there only for an instant and then gone." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "And since then?" he said. Halcombe spread his hands. "Since then it has followed me," he said. "Always just beyond sight. Always present, yet never visible." A silence fell. Holmes's gaze was intent. "And why?" he said. "Do you believe your life to be in danger?" Halcombe hesitated. "Because," he said at last night it came closer." "In what way?" Holmes asked. Halcombe's face paled. "I was in my room," he said. "The door was locked, the windows secured, and yet I saw it." Holmes did not move. "Where?" he said. "In the mirror," Halcombe whispered. I felt a distinct chill at these words. "It stood behind me," he said. "Clearer than before, yet when I turned there was nothing there." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward me, then back to the client. "And you are certain of what you saw?" he said. "As certain as I am of anything," Halcombe replied. Holmes leaned back. "This is indeed a curious matter," he said. I could not restrain myself. "Holmes," I said, "this bears some resemblance to what I observed last night." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Does it?" he said. I nodded. "The figure across the street," I said. "It vanished in precisely the same manner." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Interesting," he murmured. He turned once more to Halcombe. "You have done wisely to come to me," he said, "for I believe your case is not one of imagination but of design." Halcombe leaned forward eagerly. "You mean you believe me?" he said. "I believe," Holmes replied, "that you are experiencing something real. The question is not whether you are followed, but how." A silence fell upon the room. Holmes rose. "Come, Watson," he said. "We have a Kai-san one which promises to be of the most singular character." As I took up my hat, I could not help but feel that a shadow, subtle, elusive, and deeply unsettling, had already begun to fall across our lives. And though I did not yet know it, that shadow would soon come to rest much closer to me than I could possibly have imagined. It is one of the peculiar advantages of my long association with Sherlock Holmes that I have learned, in some degree, to recognize the moments at which his interest is genuinely aroused. There is, in such instances, a subtle sharpening of his manner, a quiet concentration which replaces his habitual languor, and a precision in his speech which admits of no frivolity. I observed this change in him as soon as our visitor, Mr. Edward Halcombe, had concluded his account. Holmes remained standing for a moment, his gaze fixed not upon the man but upon the middle distance, as though arranging the fragments of a puzzle already half formed in his mind. Then, with a sudden decision, he crossed to the mantel and took up his hat. "You will accompany us, Mr. Halcombe," he said. "There are certain observations which must be made upon the ground." Halcombe rose at once, relief and anxiety contending in his expression. "You believe there is something to be seen?" he said. Holmes gave a faint smile. "There is always something to be seen," he replied. "The question is whether we know how to look." The morning air was sharp and invigorating as we stepped out into Baker Street. The city, newly awakened, bustled with its usual energy, yet I could not rid myself of the impression that beneath this ordinary activity there lurked something less tangible, a presence not easily defined. Holmes set a brisk pace, leading us through a succession of streets toward the district in which Halcombe resided. Our client walked between us, his eyes darting occasionally over his shoulder, as though expecting at any moment to catch sight of the elusive figure he had described. "You must endeavor to compose yourself," Holmes said quietly. "Nervous anticipation is the very condition upon which such effects depend." Halcombe made an effort to steady himself. "You think it is merely my imagination, then?" he said. Holmes shook his head. "On the contrary," he replied, "I think it is something far more deliberate." I glanced at him. "You have already formed a theory?" I said. Holmes's lips curved slightly. "I have formed several," he said, "but I shall reserve them until we have gathered sufficient data to eliminate the less probable." This, I knew, was as much as I was likely to obtain from him for the present. Halcombe's residence proved to be a modest but well-appointed house in a quiet street. He admitted us with evident haste, closing the door behind us as though to exclude some unseen pursuer. "It was here," he said, leading us into a small sitting-room. Last night Holmes entered without comment, and began at once to examine the room with that minute attention which so often revealed what others overlooked. He moved from object to object, the furniture, the curtains, the mantelpiece, pausing occasionally to inspect some detail invisible to my own eye. At length he came to the mirror. It was a large piece, mounted above a narrow table, and so positioned as to reflect the greater part of the room. Holmes stood before it for several moments, his head slightly inclined. "You saw the figure here?" he said. Halcombe nodded. "Yes," he said. "Behind me just there." Holmes did not turn. "And when you looked directly?" he asked. "There was nothing," Halcombe replied. Holmes raised a hand and adjusted the curtain slightly, altering the angle of the light. "Stand where you were," he said. Halcombe obeyed, taking up a position before the mirror. Holmes stepped back, observing. "Now," he said, "remain perfectly still." We watched in silence. For a moment nothing occurred. Then, quite suddenly, I became aware of something which caused my breath to catch. In the glass, just beyond Halcombe's shoulder, there appeared a faint suggestion of movement, a shadow, so slight that it might have been dismissed as a trick of the light, yet possessing a form too definite to be entirely accidental. I stepped forward involuntarily. "Holmes," I said, "there is something." Holmes raised a hand. "Do not move," he said softly. The shadow lingered for an instant and then was gone. Halcombe turned sharply. "You see?" he cried. "You see it?" Holmes's expression, however, remained composed. "I see," he said, "that your experience has a basis in fact." He moved closer to the mirror, examining its surface with care. "A reflection," he murmured. "But of what?" I looked about the room. "There is nothing behind him," I said. Holmes nodded. "Precisely," he said, "and yet something is reflected." He turned to Halcombe. "You have observed this phenomenon only at night?" he asked. "Yes," Halcombe replied. "When the lamps are lit." Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "Ah," he said, "that is significant." He stepped back and surveyed the room once more. "There is a source," he continued, "and there is a medium. The effect is not spontaneous as is produced." I felt a stirring of excitement. "You believe someone is creating this illusion?" I said. Holmes inclined his head. "I believe," he said, "that someone is taking advantage of certain conditions to produce a very specific impression." Halcombe's face paled. "Then I am being watched," he said. Holmes turned to him. "Not necessarily," he replied. "But you are certainly being made to believe that you are." We spent the next hour in a thorough examination of the house, though nothing further of immediate significance presented itself. Holmes, however, appeared far from discouraged. On the contrary, there was in his manner a growing sense of interest which suggested that the case had begun to assume a more definite shape in his mind. As we prepared to depart, Halcombe caught Holmes's arm. "You will not leave me unprotected?" he said anxiously. Holmes regarded him steadily. "You are in no immediate danger," he said. "Of that I am confident. But the shadow," Halcombe began. Holmes raised a hand. "Is a device," he said, "and like all devices it has a purpose." "And what purpose is that?" I asked. Holmes turned toward the door. "That," he said, "is what we must discover." As we stepped once more into the street, I found myself turning over the events of the morning with increasing perplexity. "There is something in this which I cannot reconcile," I said. If the shadow is an illusion, why direct it at Halcombe? Why not simply act if harm is intended? Holmes walked in silence for several steps before replying. Because, he said at last, harm may not be the primary objective. I glanced at him. You mean it is meant to frighten him? I said. Holmes shook his head. Fear is a byproduct, he said, not the aim. Then what is? I asked. Holmes stopped and turned toward me. Attention, he said. I stared at him. Attention? I repeated. Holmes nodded. To create a sense of being observed, he said. To occupy the mind to direct it toward a single idea. And while that idea holds his attention, I said slowly, other things may pass unnoticed, Holmes finished. A chill ran through me. You believe this is a diversion, I said. Holmes's eyes gleamed. I believe, he said, that Mr. Halcombe's shadow is not following him at all. Then what is it following? I asked. Holmes's gaze met mine. You, Watson, he said quietly. I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath me. Me? Holmes inclined his head. You were the first to observe a figure watching Baker Street, he said. You, not Halcombe. And you described its disappearance in terms strikingly similar to his own experience. I struggled to collect my thoughts. You mean this is connected to me? I said. Holmes's expression was grave. I mean, he said, that you are already part of the pattern. A silence fell between us. For the first time since the case had begun, I felt not merely curiosity but a distinct and personal unease. For if Holmes was correct, then the shadow which had seemed to pursue another had, in truth, been following me all along. I have observed upon many occasions that when Sherlock Holmes declares a matter to possess a pattern, it is seldom long before that pattern reveals itself in some tangible and often disturbing form. It was with such an expectation, though not without a degree of personal unease, that I accompanied him on the afternoon following our visit to Mr. Halcombe's residence. Holmes had for the greater part of the morning remained uncharacteristically silent. He had declined both breakfast conversation and my attempts to revisit the troubling suggestion he had made that the shadow, which Halcombe believed to follow him, might in truth bear some relation to myself. Instead, he occupied himself with a close examination of certain notes he had taken, punctuated by intervals of deep thought in which his gaze would rest upon nothing in particular. At last, shortly after midday, he rose with a decisive motion. "We shall proceed to the city," he said. "There is a point which requires immediate clarification." "And that is?" I asked. Holmes took up his coat. "The origin of our client's anxiety," he replied. "For while Mr. Halcombe believes himself to be the object of pursuit, I am not yet convinced that he understands the true beginning of his difficulty." I could not suppress a slight impatience. "You have hinted more than once, Holmes, that this matter concerns me more directly than I might wish," I said. "Yet you have not explained how." Holmes paused, regarding me with that keen, penetrating look which I have often found both disconcerting and reassuring. "My dear Watson," he said, "I have not explained it because I do not yet fully understand it. And until I do, speculation would serve only to alarm you unnecessarily." "I am already alarmed," I replied. Holmes's lips twitched faintly. "Then let us endeavor to replace alarm with knowledge," he said. "Our destination proved to be the office at which Mr. Halcombe was employed, a firm of solicitors situated in a narrow street not far from the Strand. The building itself bore the respectable, somewhat austere appearance characteristic of such establishments, its windows high and narrow, its entrance unadorned. Holmes entered without hesitation, and we were soon shown into a modest room where Halcombe had, we were informed, conducted his work. "This is where he was on the evening in question?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir," replied the clerk who attended us. "Mr. Halcombe remained later than usual that night." Holmes dismissed the man with a nod and turned his attention to the room. It was, at first glance, entirely ordinary. A desk, neatly arranged shelves of documents, a single lamp positioned to illuminate the working surface. Yet I had learned long ago that it was precisely such ordinary settings in which Holmes was most likely to discover the extraordinary. He moved about the room slowly, examining each object with care. At length he came to the desk and stood looking down at it in silence. "What do you observe, Watson?" he said. I stepped forward. "Nothing out of the usual," I replied. "Everything appears to be in order." Holmes nodded. "Precisely," he said. "And yet something has occurred here which has set in motion a chain of events extending to Baker Street." He reached out and adjusted the lamp slightly, altering the angle of the light. Consider, he continued, the circumstances described by our client. He remained here late. He was alone, and it was upon leaving this place that he first experienced the sensation of being followed. Yes, I said. That is correct. Holmes leaned closer to the desk. And yet, he said softly, there is no indication that anything unusual occurred at the moment of his departure. He straightened. No sign of disturbance, no evidence of intrusion, no irregularity in his immediate surroundings. I frowned. Then what are we to conclude? I said. Holmes turned to me. That the disturbance did not occur at the moment of departure, he said, but before it. I looked about the room again, more carefully this time. You believe something happened here while he was still inside, I said. Holmes inclined his head. I do, he said. He moved to the window which overlooked the narrow street below. Tell me, he said, what do you notice about this position? I joined him. The view is limited, I said. The street is narrow, and the buildings opposite are close. Just so, Holmes replied. A man standing below would be difficult to observe from within, particularly at night. I felt a slight stirring of recognition. Like the figure I saw outside Baker Street, I said. Holmes gave a faint smile. An excellent comparison, he said. He turned back to the room. Now consider the lamp, he continued. Positioned as it is, it illuminates the desk but leaves the greater part of the room in relative shadow. I nodded. Yes, I said. That is true. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A man seated here, he said, indicating the chair, would be clearly visible to anyone outside, yet unable to see beyond the immediate circle of light. A chill passed through me. You mean someone could have been watching him, I said, without being seen. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely, he said. He returned to the desk and opened one of the drawers. And now, he said, we must ask what did he do while he was here? He examined the contents briefly, then withdrew a sheet of paper. This, he said, handing it to me, is a copy of a document which Mr. Halcombe prepared that evening. I glanced at it. It appears to be a legal draft, I said. Nothing remarkable. Holmes watched me. To be a legal draft, I said. Nothing remarkable. Holmes watched me closely. Read the name, he said. I did so and felt a sudden tightening in my chest. Good heavens, I said. That is... Yes, Holmes said quietly. A name with which you are familiar. I looked up at him. But that is impossible, I said. That case was concluded years ago. Holmes's expression was grave. So you believed, he said. I stared again at the document, my mind racing. This concerns a man who, I began. Who had reason to bear you a grudge, Holmes finished. A silence fell. You believe this is connected? I said. Holmes folded the paper carefully. I believe, he said, that Mr. Halcombe has, quite unknowingly, placed himself in the path of a design which has its origins elsewhere and which has now extended to include you. I felt a distinct unease. Then the shadow, I said. Holmes met my gaze. Is not a random occurrence, he said. It is a message. A message? I repeated. Holmes nodded. A signal, he said. A means of indicating presence without direct confrontation. And directed at me, I said slowly. Holmes's expression did not soften. I think it highly probable, he said. I drew a breath. But who? I began. Holmes raised a hand. That, he said, is the question which remains. We left the office soon after, Holmes having satisfied himself that no further immediate evidence was to be found there. Yet as we stepped once more into the busy thoroughfare, I could not escape the growing sense that the case had taken on a far more personal dimension than I had at first supposed. You have recognized the name, Holmes said quietly as we walked. I have, I replied, though I would have preferred not to. Holmes glanced at me. And you have not spoken of it, he said. I wish to be certain, I answered. Holmes inclined his head. A wise precaution, he said. I hesitated, then spoke. If I am correct, I said, then the man in question is no longer at liberty. Holmes's eyes flickered. Officially, he said. I stopped. You mean, I said. Holmes turned to face me. I mean, he said, that the past has a way of returning, particularly when it has not been entirely resolved. A cold certainty settled upon me. Then we are not dealing merely with illusion, I said, but with intention. Holmes's expression was firm. With both, he said. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, I found myself more conscious than ever of my surroundings. The passing figures, the shifting shadows, the reflections in the windows all seemed to carry a significance which I could not easily dismiss. And though I strained my eyes more than once in an effort to detect some sign of the presence which had been so subtly suggested, I saw nothing. Yet the absence of evidence did little to reassure me. for I had come by that time to understand that in this case what was unseen might prove far more dangerous than what was plainly visible. It has long been my observation that the involvement of the official police, while often indispensable, seldom serves to simplify those cases which fall under the peculiar province of Sherlock Holmes. On the contrary, their presence frequently introduces a degree of confidence premature, and therefore hazardous, which obscures rather than illuminates the truth. Such was precisely the effect produced when, upon the morning following our visit to Mr. Halcombe's office, Inspector Lestrade made his appearance at Baker Street. Holmes had been engaged in one of his quieter occupations, seated at the table with a chemical apparatus before him, from which there arose at intervals a faint, acrid vapor. His attention appeared wholly absorbed in the delicate manipulation of certain reagents, and I had been careful not to disturb him, though my own thoughts remained fixed upon the troubling developments of the case. Mrs. Hudson's announcement was scarcely complete before Lestrade entered with his customary briskness, his keen eyes moving rapidly about the room as though expecting to find some immediate confirmation of his purpose. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Doctor." Holmes did not look up at once. "Good morning, Lestrade," he replied. "You bring news." Lestrade allowed himself a brief smile. "I do," he said, "and I think you'll find it of interest." Holmes set aside his instrument and turned. "Pray proceed," he said. Lestrade drew a folded paper from his pocket. "We've had a development in your shadow affair," he said. "A man has come forward, or rather been brought forward, whose movements correspond rather closely with the reports you've been investigating." I felt a slight quickening of interest. "A suspect?" I said. Lestrade nodded. "A very likely one," he replied. "Name of Arthur Pell. A clerk of no fixed position, known to frequent the very districts where your client has observed this so-called shadow." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And upon what grounds do you connect him with the phenomenon?" he asked. Lestrade unfolded the paper. "Witness statements," he said. "Several individuals have reported seeing a man of his description loitering near Halcombe's residence and, more to the point, near Baker Street itself." I glanced at Holmes. "The figure I observed," I said. "Just so," Lestrade replied. "Tall, somewhat gaunt, keeps to the shadows. He was picked up late last night not far from here." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And what explanation does Mr. Pell offer for his presence?" he asked. Lestrade gave a short laugh. "An unconvincing one," he said. "He claims to have been merely taking the air." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "A pursuit rarely conducted in so deliberate a manner," he said. "Exactly," Lestrade replied. "We have him at the Yard. I thought you might care to take a look before we proceed further." Holmes rose at once. "I should be most interested," he said. The journey to Scotland Yard was conducted in comparative silence. Lestrade, I observed, carried himself with an air of quiet satisfaction, as though confident that the matter was already well in hand. Holmes, on the other hand, appeared thoughtful rather than convinced, his gaze fixed upon the passing streets. "You are not persuaded," I said at last. Holmes glanced at me. "I am rarely persuaded by the first explanation which presents itself," he replied, "particularly when it aligns so neatly with expectation." Lestrade turned slightly in his seat. "You think we have the wrong man?" he said. "I think," Holmes replied, "that we may have the right man for the wrong reason." Lestrade frowned. "I'm not sure I follow," he said. Holmes did not elaborate. "Let us hear what Mr. Pell has to say," he said. Arthur Pell proved to be a man of unremarkable appearance, which in itself might have recommended him as a suitable candidate for the role he was suspected of playing. He was seated in a small interview-room, his posture tense, his eyes shifting nervously between the three of us as we entered. "This is the gentleman," Lestrade said. Holmes regarded him quietly for a moment. "You have been observed," he said at last, "in the vicinity of Baker Street on more than one occasion." Pell swallowed. "I walk there sometimes," he said. "There's nothing wrong in that." "Certainly not," Holmes replied. "And yet your manner of walking has attracted attention." Pell's hands tightened. "I don't know what you mean," he said. Holmes stepped closer. "You keep to the shadows," he said. "You remain still for long periods. You avoid direct observation." Pell's face paled slightly. "I don't like crowds," he said. "That's all." Lestrade interjected. "And what about Halcombe's house?" he said. "You've been seen there as well." Pell hesitated. "I passed that way," he said weakly. Holmes's eyes rested upon him with quiet intensity. "And the mirror," he said softly. Pell started. "The what?" he said. Holmes did not press the point directly. "You have no knowledge," he said, "of any device or method by which a figure might be made to appear in a reflective surface without being physically present?" Pell shook his head rapidly. "No, sir," he said, "nothing of the kind." Holmes watched him for a moment longer, then turned away. "Thank you," he said. Lestrade looked surprised. "That's it," he said. "For the present," Holmes replied. Once outside, Lestrade wasted no time in expressing his view. "Well," he said, "what do you make of him?" Holmes adjusted his gloves with care. "I make," he said, "that Mr. Pell is precisely what he appears to be, a man of nervous disposition, with a tendency to avoid notice." Lestrade stared. "You don't think he's our man?" he said. Holmes shook his head. "On the contrary," he said, "I think he is part of the picture, but not its author." Lestrade's impatience was evident. "He was seen in all the right places," he said. "He fits the description." Holmes inclined his head. "Which is precisely why he has been seen," he said. I felt a sudden understanding begin to form. "You mean he is meant to be noticed?" I said. Holmes's eyes flickered toward me approvingly. "Exactly, Watson," he said. "A visible shadow, if I may use the term, serves to draw attention away from that which is not visible." Lestrade frowned. "You're saying someone is using him?" he said. "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that Mr. Pell is a distraction, an element introduced to satisfy the expectations of observers." Lestrade shook his head. "That's a stretch," he said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Is it?" he said. "Consider, a man is reported to be seen lurking in shadows. The police find such a man. The case appears to resolve itself." Lestrade's expression darkened slightly. "And you think that's too convenient?" he said. Holmes's voice was calm. "I think," he said, "that convenience is the hallmark of misdirection." As we left the yard, I found myself turning over Holmes's reasoning with increasing unease. "If Pell is not the source," I said, "then the true author of these events remains entirely concealed." Holmes nodded. "Precisely," he said. "And yet," I continued, "the phenomena themselves persist, the shadow, the reflections, the sense of being followed." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Yes," he said, "and that is the most significant point of all." I looked at him. "In what way?" I asked. Holmes slowed his pace slightly. "Because," he said, "the effect does not depend upon the presence of any single individual. It is produced by conditions which may be created at will." A chill passed through me. "Then it could occur anywhere," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Anywhere," he said, "and at any time." I hesitated. "And to anyone?" I said. Holmes's eyes met mine. "No," he said quietly, "not to anyone." A silence fell between us. "To you," I said at last. Holmes did not deny it. "Yes," he said. That evening, as I sat once more in the familiar surroundings of Baker Street, I found myself more conscious than ever of the play of light and shadow within the room. The mirror above the mantel, the darkened corners, the shifting reflections in the window all seemed to carry a new and unsettling significance. Holmes, for his part, appeared absorbed in thought, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the fire. "Holmes," I said at last, "there is one point which still eludes me." He did not look up. "And that is?" he said. "Why me?" I said. "What possible purpose could be served by directing this elaborate deception toward me?" Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "That," he said, "is the question upon which the entire case depends." He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine with a gravity which I could not mistake. "And it is one," he added, "which I believe we are very close to answering." At that moment a faint sound reached Eustace's soft, almost imperceptible movement from the direction of the window. I turned instinctively. For the briefest instant I thought I saw Ita's shape, a presence, standing just beyond the glass. And then, as before, it was gone. It has often been remarked by those who have followed the accounts of Sherlock Holmes's investigations that there are moments rare, yet unmistakable, when he withholds from even his closest associate some portion of his reasoning. I do not speak here of mere delay, which is his natural habit, but of a deliberate concealment undertaken not from vanity, but from necessity. Such a moment, I am persuaded, occurred upon the evening of which I now write. The fleeting impression of a figure beyond the window had scarcely faded when I sprang to my feet and crossed the room in 2 strides. The curtain stirred slightly beneath my hand as I drew it aside, and I pressed my face close to the glass, straining my eyes into the dimness of the street below. There was nothing. The pavement lay quiet beneath the glow of the lamp. A solitary cab rattled past at some distance. A passer-by moved briskly along the far side and disappeared into the gloom. Of the shape I had thought to see, there remained not the faintest trace. "Holmes," I said, turning back, "it was their agony, I am certain of it." Holmes had not moved from his chair. "Describe it," he said calmly. "It was only for an instant," I replied. "A form tall, indistinct, standing just beyond the glass. It vanished the moment I looked directly." Holmes nodded slightly, as though this confirmed something already present in his mind. "And you perceived it first not directly," he said, "but in the periphery of your vision?" "Yes," I said. "Exactly so." Holmes leaned back, his fingers once more steepled. "An excellent demonstration," he murmured. "Of what?" I demanded. Holmes's eyes flickered toward me, and for a moment I thought I detected in them a trace of something unusual, something almost akin to caution. "Of the reliability of your senses under particular conditions," he said. I confess that this answer, though characteristic, was far from satisfying. "You speak as though this were a laboratory experiment," I said. "Yet I assure you, Holmes, there was nothing theoretical in what I saw." "I do not doubt it," he replied. "Indeed, I rely upon it." This only increased my perplexity. "Then you believe the figure to be real?" I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "I believe," he said, "that your perception of it is real. The distinction is important." I was about to press him further when he rose abruptly and crossed to the window. Unlike myself, he did not attempt to look outward, but instead examined the glass itself with close attention. He ran his fingers lightly along the frame, then bent to inspect the lower edge where the pane met the sill. After a moment he straightened. "Curious," he said. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes turned away. "Nothing of immediate consequence," he replied. I could not suppress a note of impatience. "Holmes," I said, "you have discovered something." He regarded me with a slight inclination of the head. "I have observed something," he corrected. "Whether it proves to be of consequence remains to be seen." "And you will not tell me what it is?" I said. "Not yet," he replied. There was no discourtesy in his tone, yet the firmness of his manner admitted of no argument. I was therefore compelled, though not without reluctance, to let the matter rest. The remainder of the evening passed in a state of subdued tension. Holmes occupied himself with his violin, drawing from it a series of low, meditative phrases which seemed to echo the complexity of his thoughts. I, for my part, endeavored to return to my reading, but found my attention continually drawn back to the events of the day. The idea that I myself might be the intended subject of this elaborate deception weighed upon me more heavily than I cared to admit. It was one thing to observe danger from a distance, quite another to feel its presence so intimately directed. At length, unable to endure the uncertainty, I laid aside my book. "Holmes," I said, "you have formed some conclusion." He ceased playing, though he did not at once look up. "I have formed a provisional one," he said. "And does it concern me?" I asked. Holmes set the violin aside and turned his gaze upon me. "It concerns the mechanism by which the effect is produced," he said. "And the conditions under which it is most effective," he replied. I waited. Holmes's expression was thoughtful. "It is not a shadow in the ordinary sense," he said, "nor is it a simple reflection. It is, rather, the result of a carefully arranged interplay of light, angle, and expectation." I recalled the incident at Halcombe's mirror. "You mean it is created deliberately?" I said. "Beyond doubt," Holmes replied. "Then there must be some apparatus," I said. "Some device." Holmes raised a hand. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps something far simpler." I frowned. "Simpler?" I said. Holmes nodded. "The most effective illusions," he said, "are often those which rely not upon complexity, but upon the manipulation of what is already present." He rose and paced slowly across the room. "Consider," he continued, "the circumstances in which the phenomenon occurs. A dimly lit environment, a reflective surface, a mind already predisposed to notice irregularity." "And you believe I've been predisposed?" I said. Holmes glanced at me. "You observed the figure before our client reported his experience," he said. "Your mind, therefore, was primed to recognize the pattern when it was presented again." I considered this uneasily. "Then I have been prepared?" I said. Holmes's expression grew more intent. "Precisely," he said. A silence fell. "For what purpose?" I asked. Holmes stopped before the fire, his back to me. "To ensure," he said slowly, "that when the critical moment arrives your attention will be directed exactly where it is intended." A chill ran through me. "And where is that?" I said. Holmes did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was very quiet. "That," he said, "is the point upon which I am not yet prepared to speculate aloud." I felt a sudden frustration. "You are withholding something," I said. Holmes turned, and for a moment there was a sharpness in his gaze which I have seldom seen directed toward me. "I am protecting you," he said. The words, though spoken calmly, carried a weight which silenced me. Holmes rarely spoke in such terms, and when he did, it was not without reason. It was late that night when the second incident occurred. I had retired to my room, though sleep did not come easily. The events of the day returned to me again and again, each detail assuming a significance which I could neither fully grasp nor entirely dismiss. At length, finding rest impossible, I rose and lit the lamp upon my bedside table. The mirror upon the opposite wall caught the light, casting a faint reflection of the room behind me. It was then that I saw it. At first I thought it no more than a distortion, a trick of the shifting flame. But as I looked more closely, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakable. A figure stood behind me. It was clearer than before, far clearer. I could discern the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of a head inclined slightly forward, as though observing me with a fixed and silent intent. My heart gave a sudden, violent beat. I turned at once. There was nothing. The room lay empty, the door closed, the window secure. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. For several moments I remained standing there, scarcely able to collect my thoughts. The vividness of the impression was such that I could not attribute it wholly to imagination, and yet there was no physical evidence to support its existence. At last, mastering myself, I left the room and descended to the sitting-room below. Holmes was still awake. He sat in his chair, the lamp beside him, his eyes fixed upon the door as though he had expected my arrival. "You have seen it again," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I replied. Holmes studied me closely. "And this time," he said, "it was clearer." "Yes," I said. "Much clearer." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we are approaching the critical point," he said. I stared at him. "What do you mean?" I said. Holmes rose. "I mean," he said, "that whoever is responsible for this design is preparing to move from suggestion to action." A cold weight settled in my chest. "And you still will not tell me what you suspect," I said. Holmes hesitated only for an instant. "No," he said. It was at that moment that I realized with a certainty that admitted no doubt that Holmes knew far more than he was willing to reveal, and that whatever he knew, it placed me in a position of danger more immediate than I had yet imagined. If the events of the previous evening had left me in a state of unease, those which followed served to transform that unease into something far more immediate and tangible. There are moments in life when the boundary between apprehension and reality dissolves with startling abruptness, and it was in such a moment that the case of the shadow passed from the realm of subtle suggestion into that of direct and undeniable danger. Holmes did not retire that night. I was aware of undeniable danger. Holmes did not retire that night. I was aware of this fact only in retrospect, for after my second encounter with the apparition in the mirror, I remained in the sitting-room with him for some time, pressing him, though without success, for a fuller explanation of his conclusions. He answered me with patience, but also with that immovable reserve which I had come to recognize as the sign of a mind not yet prepared to disclose its final reasoning. "You must trust me a little longer, Watson," he said. "We are upon the edge of understanding, but not yet beyond it." At length, seeing that I could obtain no more, I returned to my room, though I left the door ajar, a precaution which I should not ordinarily have deemed necessary. Sleep, when it came, was light and troubled, filled with indistinct impressions of movement and watchfulness. It must have been some hours later, how many I cannot say, that I was awakened by a sound. It was not loud. Indeed, under ordinary circumstances, I might not have noticed it at all. Yet in my heightened state of awareness it struck upon my senses with peculiar clarity. A faint creak. I lay still, my eyes open in the darkness, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then once more the same sound, slight yet unmistakable, as of a floorboard yielding beneath a cautious tread. My heart quickened. The sound came from below. I rose quietly from the bed and crossed to the door. The dim light from the stairway fell across the threshold, revealing nothing unusual. Yet as I stepped into the passage, I became aware of a presence not seen but felt, as one senses the nearness of another in the absence of sight. "Holmes?" I called softly. There was no reply. I moved toward the stairs. Halfway down I paused. The sitting-room door stood slightly open, and from within there came a faint glimmer of light, the lamp still burning. But there was something else, a shadow. It lay across the floor, cast not from within the room, but from the hall itself, stretching toward the door as though drawn by some unseen source. I descended the remaining steps with caution. "Holmes," I said again, more firmly. Still no answer. With a sudden resolve, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Holmes's chair stood as he had left it, the violin upon the table beside it. The lamp burned steadily, casting its familiar circle of light. Yet there was no sign of Holmes himself. I felt a sharp pang of alarm. "Holmes!" I called. Even as I spoke, there came a movement behind me. I turned swiftly. For a single instant I saw it clearly, unmistakably. A figure stood at the far end of the passage. It was no longer the vague suggestion of a form glimpsed in reflection or at the edge of vision. It was present solid in outline, though curiously indistinct in detail, as though the features themselves resisted clear perception. It stood motionless. Then, as I stared, it moved, not with the natural motion of a man walking, but with a strange, gliding shift, as though the light itself had altered rather than the figure within it. "Stop!" I cried, springing forward. The figure turned, or seemed to turn, and in the next instant it was gone. I reached the end of the passage and flung open the door which led to the rear of the house. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp. The yard beyond lay empty. There was no sound of retreating footsteps, no sign of disturbance. The stillness was absolute. I stood there for several moments, my breath quick, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had seen with what was physically possible. At length a voice spoke behind me. "Pray close the door, Watson. You will let in the cold." Holmes stood in the hallway, his expression composed, though there was in his eyes a brightness which I recognized at once as the mark of intense mental activity. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "Where have you been?" "Observing," he replied. "You saw it?" I said. "I saw enough," he answered. I stepped toward him. "There was a man here," I said. "I am certain of it." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "There was—" "Then why did you not stop him?" I demanded. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Because, my dear Watson," he said, "it was not yet time." I stared at him in astonishment. "Not yet time?" I repeated. "The man was in our very house." Holmes's gaze remained steady. "And what would you have had me do?" he said. "Seize a shadow?" Steady. "And what would you have had me do?" he said. "Seize a shadow? Pursue a form which exists only under certain conditions." "It was no illusion," I insisted. "I saw him plainly." Holmes nodded. "Under precisely those conditions which he intended," he said. I felt a surge of frustration. "Then he can come and go as he pleases?" I said. Holmes shook his head. "On the contrary," he said, "his movements are more restricted than he would wish us to believe." He stepped past me and closed the door, then turned back into the room. "Come," he said. "We must examine what he has left behind." "What he has left behind?" I said. "You mean he has taken nothing?" Holmes gave a short laugh. "My dear Watson," he said, "men who take the trouble to enter a house by stealth seldom do so without purpose. The question is not what he has taken, but what he has done." He moved at once to the window and bent to examine the sill. "Here," he said. I joined him. At first I saw nothing. Then, following the direction of his gaze, I detected a faint mark upon the wood, a slight abrasion, as though something metallic had been drawn across it. "A tool?" "Possibly," Holmes replied. "Or part of a mechanism." He straightened and looked about the room. "And now," he said, "we must determine the objective of his visit." I glanced toward the desk. "Papers?" I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "No sign of disturbance," he said. "Everything remains in place." "Then what?" I asked. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he turned to me. "You," he said. I felt a chill. "Me?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "You were the target of the demonstration," he said. The figure revealed itself more clearly than before. It moved within your direct line of sight. I considered this. "You mean it was meant for me to see it," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And why?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew more intent. "To condition you," he said. The word struck me with peculiar force. "Condition me?" I said. Holmes inclined his head. "To accustom your mind to the presence of that form," he said. "To reduce the element of surprise, to make the extraordinary appear familiar." I felt a growing unease. "And to what end?" I said. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the mantel and stood for a moment in thought. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "To ensure," he said, "that when the moment comes you will not react as you ought." A silence fell. "You believe," I said slowly, "that I am being prepared for something." Holmes turned, his gaze fixed upon me. "I am certain of it," he said. It was some time before either of us spoke again. The events of the night had left me with a sense of exposure which I found difficult to articulate. The idea that my perceptions themselves might be manipulated, that my responses might be shaped in advance, was one which struck at the very foundation of confidence. At length I broke the silence. "Holmes," I said, "this can go no further." He raised an eyebrow. "No?" he said. "No," I repeated. "If I am indeed the object of this design, then I have a right to know the full extent of your suspicions." Holmes regarded me steadily. "And if that knowledge places you in greater danger?" he said. "I accept that risk," I replied. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he inclined his head. "Very well," he said. "You shall know soon." "Soon?" I said. Holmes's eyes flickered toward the window. "Yes," he said, "for I believe the next move will not be long delayed." As I returned to my room in the early hours of the morning, I could not rid myself of the conviction that the case had reached a turning point. The shadow which had once seemed a distant curiosity had entered our very home, and with it had come the unmistakable presence of an intelligence both deliberate and patient. What form its next action would take I could not guess, but I knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that it would be directed once again at me. The events of that night left behind them a residue of tension which no amount of daylight could wholly dispel. Indeed, I have often found that the clarity of morning serves less to banish such impressions than to render them more sharply defined. What had been vague in darkness assumes a troubling precision beneath the sun, and it was with such a feeling that I sat across from Holmes the following morning, watching him with a degree of unease I had seldom experienced in his presence. He was already dressed when I entered the sitting-room, though the hour was early. His breakfast lay untouched beside him, and upon the table were spread a number of small objects whose nature I could not immediately determine: fragments of glass, a narrow strip of polished metal, and what appeared to be a length of darkened wire. Holmes himself was examining one of these items with a lens, his expression one of intense concentration. "You are early, Watson," he said, without looking up. "I might say the same of you," I replied. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "Sleep is a luxury ill-suited to cases of this nature," he said, "particularly when one is in the presence of a mind which prefers to operate under cover of darkness." I took a seat opposite him. "You have drawn some conclusion from last night's intrusion," I said. Holmes set aside the lens and leaned back slightly. "I have confirmed one," he replied. "And that is?" I asked. "That our adversary is neither reckless nor impulsive," Holmes said. "On the contrary, he proceeds with a degree of calculation which suggests long preparation." I glanced at the objects upon the table. "These were found in the room?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Left behind, though not by accident," he said. I picked up the strip of metal and examined it. "It is highly polished," I said. "Almost like a mirror." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "A reflective surface, small, portable, and easily concealed." "And the glass?" I asked. "Cut to a particular angle," Holmes said. "Note the edge." I did so, and observed that it had been shaped with unusual precision. "A prism?" I suggested. Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "An excellent term," he said, "though employed here not for the dispersion of light, but for its redirection." A sudden thought struck me. "You mean the figure we have seen is produced by such means?" I said. Holmes inclined his head. "In part," he replied. "The illusion depends upon the careful arrangement of reflective surfaces, combined with the observer's position and expectation." I felt a certain relief at this. "Then it is, after all, a trick," I said. Holmes regarded me with a curious expression. "A trick," he repeated. "Yes and no." I frowned. "I do not understand," I said. Holmes leaned forward. "The mechanism," he said, tapping the metal strip lightly, "is merely the instrument. The true art lies in the selection of moment and subject." "And that subject is myself," I said. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Yes," he said. A silence fell. Before I could "Yes," he said. A silence fell. Before I could pursue the matter further, there came a hurried knock at the door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice. "Mr. There." Holmes rose at once. "Show him in," he said. The door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered, his usual composure replaced by an expression of unmistakable gravity. "Holmes," he said, "there has been another incident?" Holmes did not appear surprised. "Mr. Halcombe?" he said. Lestrade nodded. "Found this morning in his office," he said. "Unconscious." I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. "Unconscious?" I said. "Is he?" "He is alive," Lestrade replied, "but in a very peculiar condition." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Tell us everything," he said. Lestrade remained standing. "He was discovered by one of the clerks," he said. "Collapsed at his desk. No sign of struggle. No visible injury." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the room?" he said. "Undisturbed," Lestrade replied. "Exactly as it was left the previous evening." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. "The mirror?" he said. Lestrade hesitated. "That is the curious part," he said. "The clerk reports that the mirror in the room was damaged." "Damaged in what way?" I asked. Lestrade drew a breath. "It was cracked," he said. "From the inside." Holmes's expression sharpened. "From the inside?" he repeated. "That is what it appears," Lestrade said, "as though something had struck it from within the glass itself." A silence fell upon the room. Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said quietly, "you will accompany me." We arrived at Halcombe's office within the half-hour, where the atmosphere was one of subdued agitation. The clerks moved about in hushed tones, casting anxious glances toward the room in which their colleague had been found. Lestrade led us inside. The scene at first glance bore a striking resemblance to that which we had observed the previous day. The desk stood in its place, the lamp unlit, the papers neatly arranged. Yet there was one detail which altered the entire character of the room: the mirror. It hung as before upon the wall, but its surface was fractured, a web of fine cracks radiating outward from a central point at approximately the height of a man's chest. Holmes approached it slowly. "Extraordinary," he murmured. I joined him, examining the damage. "It is as though something has struck it with considerable force," I said. Holmes shook his head. "Not from the outside," he said. He bent closer, his eyes tracing the pattern of the fractures. "Observe the direction," he said. "The lines radiate outward, but the point of origin lies within the plane of the glass itself." I felt a slight chill. "You mean—" I began. Holmes straightened. "I mean," he said, "that the appearance of impact has been carefully contrived." Lestrade frowned. "You don't think it was actually struck?" he said. Holmes turned to him. "I think," he said, "that it was made to appear so at precisely the moment when Mr. Halcombe was in a position to observe it." "And that caused him to collapse?" I said. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Not the fracture itself," he said, "but what accompanied it." A faint unease crept over me. "You believe he saw something?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Something more vivid, more immediate than anything we have yet experienced," he said. Lestrade crossed his arms. "And what would that be?" he said. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved about the room, examining each detail with renewed intensity. At length he came to the desk and paused. "There's something missing," he said. Lestrade looked about. "I don't see anything out of place," he said. Holmes turned to him. "That is precisely the point," he said. "What is missing is not an object but a condition." I confess that this remark did little to clarify matters. "What condition?" I asked. Holmes's gaze shifted briefly toward me. "The condition of anticipation," he said. "You mean—" I said. Holmes's voice was low. "Mr. Halcombe was not prepared," he said. "The illusion, when presented, was not gradual but immediate, and that caused him to lose consciousness," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "In all probability," he said. "A sudden shock, carefully calculated." Lestrade shook his head. "This is all very well," he said, "but we still have no man to lay hands on." Holmes's eyes flickered. "On the contrary," he said, "we are very close to him." I felt a sudden surge of anticipation. "You know who it is?" I said. Holmes turned to me. "I know," he said, "what he intends." "And what is that?" I asked. Holmes held my gaze. "To complete the pattern," he said. A silence fell. "And how is that to be done?" I said. Holmes's expression was grave. "By repeating the experiment," he said. I felt the blood drain slightly. "By repeating the experiment," he said. I felt the blood drain slightly from my face. "With me," I said. Holmes did not look away. "Yes," he said. As we left the office, I could not rid myself of the conviction that the case had entered its most dangerous phase. The attack upon Halcombe was no longer a mere suggestion of threat. It was an action, deliberate and precise, designed to test the limits of the method employed. And if Holmes was correct, then I was to be the next subject of that test. Yet what troubled me more than this was not the prospect of danger itself, but the growing sense that Holmes, for all his brilliance, was allowing events to proceed according to a design not entirely his own. For the first time since I had known him, I wondered whether he might be allowing the trap to be set not merely to catch the criminal, but to observe the full extent of his method. And if that were so, then I could not escape the uneasy conclusion that I was, in some measure, a part of that design. I have more than once remarked upon the singular manner in which Sherlock Holmes prepares for the decisive stage of an investigation. Where another man might hasten toward action, Holmes withdraws where others would speak plainly. He grows obscure, and where danger presses closest, he often appears at his most detached. To those unacquainted with his methods, such conduct might suggest uncertainty. To myself, who had seen its results too often to doubt, it signified only that he had at last perceived the full outline of the design, and was now engaged in shaping its conclusion. It was therefore with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant confidence that I observed the change in his behavior upon our return from Howcomb's office. He spoke little. Indeed, throughout the afternoon he remained almost entirely silent, pacing the room at intervals, pausing now and then to consult his notes, or to examine once more the small reflective fragments he had collected. At other times he would stand at the window, his eyes fixed not upon the street, but upon the faint reflection of the room within the glass. "You are waiting," I said at last. Holmes did not turn. "Yes," he replied. "For what?" I asked. "For the moment at which our adversary believes himself secure," he said. I rose from my chair. "And that moment is approaching?" I said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "It has already begun," he replied. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Then we must act," I said. Holmes turned at last, and there was in his expression a calm determination which I have come to associate with the final movements of a case. "We shall act," he said, "but not in the manner which might be expected." He crossed to the table and took up the narrow strip of polished metal which he had examined that morning. "You perceive, Watson," he continued, "that the essence of this affair lies not in force but in perception. Our adversary has relied upon controlling what is seen and when it is seen." "Yes," I said, "that much is clear." Holmes held the metal strip so that it caught the light. "Then we must do the same," he said. I looked at him in perplexity. "You mean to employ his own method against him?" I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely," he said. The plan which Holmes proceeded to outline was one which I confess I heard with no small degree of astonishment. "You will return to your room tonight," he said, "as you did before. You will behave in every respect as though nothing were altered." "And you?" I asked. "I shall not be here," Holmes replied. I stared at him. "Not here?" I repeated. "At such a moment?" Holmes's expression remained composed. "My absence," he said, "will form an essential part of the illusion." I could not conceal my concern. "You believe he will come again?" I said. "I am certain of it," Holmes replied. "And you would leave me to face him alone?" I said. Holmes stepped closer. "You will not be alone," he said quietly. There was something in his tone which caused me to pause. "You will be watching?" I said. Holmes did not answer directly. "I shall be near enough," he said. This was not entirely reassuring. "And what am I to do?" I asked. Holmes's gaze fixed upon me with unusual intensity. "You are to observe," he said, "and nothing more." "Nothing?" I said. "Nothing?" he repeated. "You must not move toward the figure. You must not attempt to pursue it. Above all, you must not turn away too quickly." I frowned. "Why not?" I said. Holmes raised the metal strip once more. "Because," he said, "the illusion depends upon the angle of your vision. If you alter it too abruptly, you will lose the very detail which we require." I felt a growing unease. "And what detail is that?" I asked. Holmes hesitated only for a fraction of a second. "The one which will reveal the man behind the shadow," he said. I could not entirely suppress my frustration. "You speak as though this were a simple matter of observation," I said. "Yet you know as well as I do that the effect is designed to deceive." Holmes inclined his head. "Just so," he said, "which is why we must allow it to proceed under controlled conditions." I paced the room. "You are asking me to place myself deliberately in danger," I said. Holmes's voice softened slightly. "I am asking you," he said, "to trust that the danger is less than it appears and that the opportunity is greater." I stopped and looked at him. "You are certain of this?" I said. Holmes met my gaze. "As certain as I can be," he replied. Evening fell slowly over Baker Street, the fading light giving way to the familiar glow of the lamps. The room took on that peculiar atmosphere which had, in recent days, become associated in my mind with the presence of the shadow and interplay of brightness and obscurity which seemed to conceal as much as it revealed. Holmes made his final preparations with quiet efficiency. He adjusted the position of the lamp, altered the angle of the mirror upon the wall, and placed, with careful deliberation, a small object upon the mantel, an object which I recognized as one of the reflective fragments we had examined. "You are modifying the conditions," I said. Holmes nodded. "Only slightly," he replied. "Enough to ensure that what is shown will be shown more clearly." "And he will not notice?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "He will notice," he said, "but he will not understand." There was a pause. "Holmes," I said, "there is still something you have not told me." He looked at me. "The identity of the man," I said. "You know it." Holmes did not deny it. "I have a strong suspicion," he said. "And yet you will not name him," I said. "Not until I can prove it," he replied. I shook my head slightly. "You ask a great deal of faith," I said. Holmes's expression softened. "My dear Watson," he said, "I have never yet asked it in vain." At last the moment came. Holmes took up his coat and hat. "I shall return when the matter is concluded," he said. "And until then?" I asked. "You will remain," he said. He moved toward the door, then paused. "One final instruction," he added. "When the figure appears, watch the hands." "The hands?" I repeated. Holmes inclined his head. "They will betray him," he said. With that he was gone. I was alone. The ticking of the clock upon the mantel seemed unusually loud in the stillness which followed. I took up my position in the chair, as I had done the previous night, and forced myself to remain calm. Time passed slowly, almost imperceptibly. At length the familiar sense of unease began to return, that subtle awareness of something not immediately visible, yet undeniably present. I kept my gaze fixed upon the mirror. For several minutes nothing occurred. Then, gradually, so gradually that I could not say at what precise moment it began, I became aware of a change, a dimming of the light, a shifting of the reflection. And then the figure. It stood behind me, clearer than ever before. The outline was distinct now, almost solid. I could see the shape of the shoulders, the tilt of the head, the faint suggestion of clothing. My heart beat rapidly, but I forced myself to remain still. Holmes's instructions echoed in my mind. Watch the hands. Slowly, very slowly, I adjusted my focus. At first I could distinguish nothing beyond the general form. Then, as my eyes adapted, I perceived them. The hands. They were raised, slightly positioned, in a manner which struck me at once as unnatural. Not the relaxed posture of a man standing at ease, but something more deliberate, as though holding something. A faint glimmer caught the light. Metal. In that instant understanding dawned. The figure was not merely being seen. It was being constructed. "Now, Watson," came Holmes's voice from the darkness. The figure shifted, and with a sudden movement Holmes sprang forward from the shadowed corner of the room. There was a cry, a real one this time, and the figure collapsed into confusion as a man stumbled into view, his hands clutching a small arrangement of mirrors and polished surfaces. Lestrade followed close behind, seizing the man before he could escape. "Got him!" he cried. The illusion vanished at once. Where there had been a shadow, there was now only a man, thin, pale, his expression one of desperate defeat. Holmes stood over him, his face calm. "As I thought," he said. I rose, scarcely able to believe what I had witnessed. "You knew," I said. Holmes turned to me. "I knew enough," he replied. Lestrade secured the prisoner. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "you were right again." Holmes glanced down at the man. "Yes," he said quietly, "but he is not the one we seek." I felt a sudden shock. "Not?" I began. Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "He is merely the instrument." The man looked up, his voice trembling. "I was told," he began. Holmes raised a hand. "And you shall tell us," he said, "by whom." As I stood there, the pieces of the puzzle began at last to align, yet the central figure, the true architect of the design, remained unseen. The shadow had been unmasked, but the mind behind it still lay in darkness. It is a peculiar quality of my friend Sherlock Holmes that, even at the moment when success appears most nearly within his grasp, he is seldom inclined to display any outward sign of triumph. On the contrary, he grows, if anything, more reserved, more exacting in his manner, until the final thread of the matter has been secured. Thus it was that, despite the dramatic unmasking of the figure in my room, Holmes betrayed no satisfaction beyond a slight narrowing of the eyes and a quiet firmness of tone. The man who had been seized, our supposed shadow, sat now under the close supervision of Inspector Lestrade in the sitting-room of Baker Street. His name, as we soon learned, was Edwin Markham, a person of obscure occupation and even more obscure associations. His hands, which had so recently held a curious arrangement of reflective instruments, trembled visibly as he cast anxious glances from one face to another. Holmes stood by the mantel, his back partially turned, as though the prisoner himself were of only secondary interest. "You understand, Mr. Markham," he said at last. that your position would be greatly improved by a full and immediate disclosure." The man swallowed. "I've done nothing but what I was told," he said. "I swear it." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I have no doubt of that," he replied. "You are, as I have already remarked, an instrument. But instruments, though passive, are not without knowledge of the hand that employs them." Markham hesitated. "I don't know his name," he said. Holmes turned. "No?" he said. "And yet you have received instructions, precise ones, I imagine." The man nodded reluctantly. "Written?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Markham said. "Always written. And delivered how?" Holmes continued. "Left for me," the man replied. "At a place we agreed." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A place chosen by whom?" he said. Markham shifted uneasily. "By him," he said. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with Lestrade. "And you have never seen this individual?" he asked. Markham shook his head. "Never clearly," he said. "Only once at a distance. It was dark."
This audio was created with async.com.
"Never clearly," he said. "Only once at a distance. It was dark." Holmes was silent for a moment. "Describe what you saw," he said. Markham frowned as though struggling to recall. "A man," he said slowly. "Tall, wrapped in a coat. His face I couldn't make it out." Holmes's expression did not change. "His manner?" he asked. Markham hesitated again. "Quiet," he said. But he paused. "But what?" Holmes prompted. "There was something about him," Markham said. "Something steady, like he knew exactly what he was doing." Holmes gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he murmured. "That accords with my own impression." Lestrade stepped forward. "This is all very well," he said, "but it doesn't give us much to go on. We have a man, but not the master." Holmes turned to him. "On the contrary, Lestrade," he said, "we have a great deal." I could not restrain myself. "Holmes," I said, "you speak as though the identity of this person were already known to you." Holmes met my gaze. "It is," he said quietly. A silence fell. Lestrade stared. "You mean to say you know who's behind all this?" he said. Holmes inclined his head. "I do," he replied. "Then why not say so?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Because," he said, "it is not yet time." I confess that this answer tried my patience. "Not yet time?" I repeated. "Holmes, the man has broken into our rooms, assaulted Halcombe, and subjected us both to a series of calculated deceptions, and you would still delay?" Holmes's expression remained composed. "I would ensure," he said, "that when we act, we do so with complete certainty." He turned back to Markham. "You will remain in custody," he said. "Your cooperation will be taken into account." The man nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'll tell you anything I know." Holmes gave a slight bow of the head. "I have no doubt of it," he said. Once Markham had been removed under Lestrade's supervision, Holmes resumed his place by the fire. For some moments he remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames, as though tracing within them the final connections of the case. I stood opposite him, my mind filled with questions. "At least tell me this," I said at last. "The name we saw in Halcombe's office, the one connected with my past, does it belong to the man you suspect?" Holmes did not look up. "It does," he said. A chill ran through me. "Then I was correct," I said. "It is he." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You have, I think, already arrived at the conclusion," he said. I drew a slow breath. "But that is impossible," I said. "The man was convicted. He was incarcerated," Holmes finished. "And you believe he is now at liberty?" I said. Holmes's eyes lifted to mine. "I believe," he said, "that he has contrived to operate beyond the reach of ordinary observation, just as he has done throughout this affair." I paced the room. "But why this elaborate scheme?" I said. "Why not act directly?" Holmes rose. "Because," he said, "direct action would fail." He moved toward the table and took up one of the reflective fragments. Adversary," he continued, "possesses a mind of no ordinary order. He understands that the surest means of influencing a man is not through force, but through perception." I considered this. "You mean he wished to unbalance me?" I said. Holmes nodded. "Gradually," he said, "by introducing a recurring phenomenon, one which would at first appear uncertain, then increasingly real." "And to what end?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew grave. "To induce a moment of hesitation," he said. "A failure of immediate judgment at a critical instant." I felt a growing unease. "And that instant has not yet occurred?" I said. Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "But it is imminent." A silence fell. "Then we must prevent it," I said. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Precisely," he said. It was at this point that Holmes, having satisfied himself that all necessary elements were now in place, resolved to bring the principal figures of the case together. Messages were dispatched with characteristic efficiency, and by the following evening our sitting-room contained, in addition to ourselves, Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Halcombe, still pale, but recovered sufficiently to be present, and two other gentlemen whose identities I shall for the moment reserve. Holmes stood before the assembled company, his manner calm, his voice clear. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are met to consider a series of events which, though at first sight disconnected, are in fact parts of a single and carefully constructed design." He paused, allowing his gaze to pass from one face to another. "A design," he continued, "which has employed the illusion of a shadow not as an end in itself, but as a means to a more dangerous purpose." Halcombe shifted uneasily. "You mean the figure I saw," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "And the one seen by Dr. Watson," he said. Lestrade crossed his arms. "And the man we've got in custody," he added. Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said. "All these elements are connected, but none of them, taken alone, reveal the true nature of the case." He turned slightly, his eyes resting upon me. "The key," he said, "lies in the selection of the subject." I felt the attention of the room shift toward me. "Dr. Watson," Holmes continued, "was not chosen at random." Halcombe looked surprised. "You mean this was all directed at him?" he said. Holmes inclined his head. "From the beginning," he said. A murmur passed through the room. "And why?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes's expression was very grave. "Because," he said, "Dr. Watson once played a decisive role in the downfall of a man whose abilities, though misapplied, were of a most exceptional character." I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes turned fully now, his voice quiet but unmistakable. "That man," he said, "has now returned." A silence fell deep and absolute. "And he has not forgotten," Holmes added. As I stood there, the full weight of the revelation settled upon me. The shadow, the reflections, the calculated appearances, all were but the prelude to something far more direct. The game, as Holmes would have said, was now truly afoot. And the final move had yet to be made. There are few moments in the course of any investigation more striking than that in which Sherlock Holmes, having gathered together the scattered threads of a mystery, proceeds to weave them into a single coherent design. It is a process at once methodical and dramatic, and though I had witnessed it many times before, I confess that on this occasion it held for me a peculiar intensity, for I stood not merely as observer, but as one intimately concerned in its outcome. Holmes remained standing before the assembled company, his tall, spare figure outlined against the lamplight, his expression composed, yet charged with that quiet authority which never failed to command attention. "You will permit me," he began, "to recapitulate briefly the principal facts of the case, in order that their connection may be made clear." He turned slightly, his gaze resting first upon Mr. Halcombe. "Mr. Halcombe, you experienced, upon leaving your office, the impression of being followed, an impression which soon developed into the repeated appearance of a figure, glimpsed under conditions of uncertain light." Halcombe nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is correct." Holmes inclined his head. "Subsequently," he continued, "a similar phenomenon was observed by Dr. Watson, first in the street outside Baker Street, and later within this very room." He glanced toward me, and I could not but recall with a shudder the vividness of that second encounter. "These appearances," Holmes went on, "were not, as might be supposed, the result of any supernatural agency, nor even of a simple deception, but of a carefully constructed system of visual manipulation." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "You mean the mirrors and such," he said. Holmes gave a slight nod. "Precisely," he said. "Reflective surfaces, small, portable, and arranged in such a manner as to project an image where none exists in reality." He took up one of the polished fragments from the table and held it so that it caught the light. "By controlling the angle of reflection," he continued, "and by selecting moments in which the observer's attention is already engaged or uncertain, it becomes possible to produce the appearance of a figure, one which seems to move, to follow, even to approach." Halcombe shuddered. "Then it was all an illusion," he said. Holmes's eyes rested upon him with quiet intensity. "An illusion," he said, "with a very real purpose." He replaced the fragment and turned again to the room. "The first stage of the design," he said, "was to establish the phenomenon, to create a pattern which would be recognized and gradually accepted." I felt the truth of this at once. "The repeated sightings," I said. The growing clarity. Holmes inclined his head. Exactly, Watson, he said. Each appearance served to strengthen the impression, to reduce the element of doubt, until the observer yourself came to regard the figure not as a possibility, but as a certainty. Lestrade frowned. "And the man we caught?" he said. "Markham?" "A necessary agent," Holmes replied. "A visible presence to satisfy inquiry, a shadow to conceal the true shadow." There was a murmur of understanding. "But he was not the origin," Holmes continued. "Merely the means." He paused, allowing the weight of his next words to settle. "The second stage," he said, "was to refine the illusion, to increase its vividness, its immediacy, until it could withstand direct observation. I recalled with a tightening of the chest the figure I had seen in my own mirror. "The hands," I said suddenly. "You told me to watch the hands." Holmes's eyes flickered toward me approvingly. "Yes," he said, "because it is in the hands that the illusion betrays itself. The necessity of holding the apparatus imposes a rigidity which cannot be entirely concealed." Lestrade gave a short nod. "That's how we got him," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "Just so," he said. But even that was not the end. He moved slowly across the room, his voice lowering slightly. "The third stage," he said, "was the most dangerous." A silence fell. "To employ the illusion not merely as a curiosity," he continued, "but as a weapon." Halcombe drew a sharp breath. "The mirror," he said. Holmes turned to him. "Precisely," he said. "The sudden fracture, the apparent emergence of the figure from within glass, was designed to produce a shock of sufficient intensity to overwhelm the senses." "And it nearly did," Halcombe said faintly. Holmes inclined his head. "You were not prepared," he said. "The effect, therefore, was complete. I felt a chill." "And I was being prepared," I said. Holmes's gaze met mine. "Yes," he said quietly. A long silence followed. Lestrade cleared his throat. "All very clever," he said, "but we're still missing one thing, the man who planned it." Holmes turned. "On the contrary," he said, "we are not missing him at all." Every eye in the room fixed upon him. Holmes drew himself up slightly, and there was in his manner now a quiet finality. "The individual responsible for this design," he said, "is a man whose abilities I have had occasion to observe in the past, abilities of a rare and dangerous order, particularly in the field of psychological manipulation." He paused. "A man who understands not only how to deceive the eye, but how to influence the mind behind it." I felt my pulse quicken. Holmes's voice remained steady. "Some years ago," he continued, "this man was brought to justice through the combined efforts of the authorities and, in no small measure, through the testimony of Dr. Watson." A murmur passed through the room. Halcombe looked from Holmes to me in astonishment. "You?" he said. I said nothing. Holmes's gaze did not leave my face. "The man in question," he said, "was convicted and confined. But confinement in his case proved insufficient to extinguish either his ingenuity or his desire for revenge." Lestrade leaned forward. "You mean he got out?" he said. Holmes's expression hardened slightly. "I mean," he said, "that he found means to continue his work whether from within or without the walls assigned to him." A silence fell. "And his name?" Lestrade said. Holmes spoke it quietly, but with a clarity that seemed to echo through the room. "Professor Adrian Voss." The name struck me with the force of a physical blow. For a moment I could not speak. "It cannot be," I said at last. "Voss was incarcerated," Holmes said. "Yes." "A man of science of optics, in particular, and of no small reputation before his fall. Memories long buried rose with sudden vividness. He conducted experiments," I said slowly, "on perception on the limits of visual certainty." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely," he said. "Experiments which, when directed toward less scrupulous ends, become instruments of remarkable power." Lestrade frowned. "And you think he's behind all this?" he said. Holmes's voice was firm. "I do not think it," he said. "I know it." Halcombe looked bewildered. "But why me?" he said. "What part have I in this?" Holmes turned to him. "You have none," he said. "You were chosen because your circumstances allowed the first stage of the experiment to be conducted without immediate suspicion." "And Watson?" Lestrade said. Holmes's gaze returned to me. "Watson," he said, "is the true objective." A cold stillness settled upon me. "Because of the past," I said. Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said, "and because, having studied your habits, your perceptions, your very manner of observation, Voss has sought to construct a situation in which your judgment might fail at a critical instant." "And that instant is yet to come," I said. Holmes's expression was grave. "Yes," he said, "but it is very near." A silence fell. Lestrade spoke first. "Then we must find him," he said. Holmes shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "we must allow him to come to us." I felt a sudden tension. "You know where he will strike?" I said. Holmes's eyes met mine. "I know where he intends to complete his design," he said. "And where is that?" I asked. Holmes's voice was quiet. "Here," he said. The words seemed to hang in the air. "In this room?" Lestrade said. Holmes inclined his head. "Yes," he said. "He has already entered it once, through his agent. He has observed its conditions. He knows its arrangement. And he will return?" I said. Holmes's gaze did not waver. "He must," he said, "for the final stage requires his presence." A chill passed through the room. "And when he does," Lestrade said, "we'll be ready." Holmes's expression was calm. "We shall," he said. As the company dispersed, each man carrying with him the weight of what had been revealed, I remained standing by the fire, my thoughts in turmoil. "Holmes," I said at last, "you have placed me at the center of this affair." Holmes approached me. "You were placed there long ago," he said. "And you would use me still," I said. Holmes's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. "I would trust you," he said. I looked at him steadily. "Then let us finish it," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "We shall," he replied. That night, as the lamps burned low and the shadows gathered once more within the familiar walls of Baker Street, I could not escape the conviction that the long and intricate design had at last reached its final stage. The shadow had been explained. The mind behind it had been named, and somewhere, in the darkness beyond our sight, that mind was preparing to strike. It is one thing to anticipate danger in the abstract, and quite another to await it in full knowledge of its nature and intent. The hours which preceded the final confrontation in the case of Professor Adrian Voss were marked, for me, by a peculiar tension, neither fear in its ordinary sense, nor yet the calm of resignation, but something between the two. A heightened awareness of every detail, every sound, every shifting of light within the room. Holmes, by contrast, appeared entirely composed. He had made his arrangements with the utmost care. The position of the lamps had been adjusted once more, the mirrors set at angles which, though imperceptible to a casual observer, were clearly of significance to his purpose. Inspector Lestrade and 2 constables were concealed in the adjoining room, with instructions to remain out of sight until the proper moment. As for myself, I resumed my place in the chair before the mirror. "You understand what is required of you," Holmes said quietly. "I do," I replied. "You must act precisely as you have done before," he continued. "No more, no less." "And when he appears?" I asked. Holmes's eyes held mine. "You will not move," he said. "Whatever you may see, you will remain as you are until I give the signal." I inclined my head. "Very well," I said. Holmes stepped back into the shadow near the door, where his tall figure became almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself. "Then we are ready," he said. The room fell into silence. Time passed slowly, so slowly that each minute seemed to stretch into many. The ticking of the clock marked the progression with relentless regularity, and I found myself counting the intervals almost unconsciously, as though by doing so I might maintain some measure of control over the situation. At length the familiar sensation returned. It began as before with a subtle alteration in the lighted dimming, scarcely perceptible, yet sufficient to draw the eye. The reflection in the mirror shifted slightly, as though the room itself had changed position. Then gradually the figure took form. It stood behind me clearer than ever before. There was no longer any doubt as to its shape. The outline was distinct, the posture unmistakable. It leaned slightly forward, as though observing me with a fixed and deliberate attention. My pulse quickened, but I remained still. Holmes's instructions echoed in my mind. "Do not move." The figure advanced or seemed to advance. The movement was subtle, yet undeniable. Then, for the first time, I saw the face. Not clearly, not in the ordinary sense, but sufficiently to perceive its expression. And unmistakably intelligent. A voice spoke. "Dr. Watson." It was low, measured, and carried a peculiar clarity, as though each word had been carefully weighed before its utterance. I did not turn. "You have been most obliging," the voice continued. "Your cooperation has exceeded expectation. I felt a surge of anger, but I mastered it. You have taken great pains to secure it," I said. There was a faint pause. "Indeed," the voice replied. "The human mind is most susceptible to repetition. What is at first doubted becomes, with sufficient reinforcement, accepted." Holmes's voice came from the darkness. "And what is accepted," he said, "may be used." The figure in the mirror did not start. "So," the voice said softly, "Mr. Holmes chooses at last to join us." In the next instant Holmes stepped forward into the light. The illusion faltered. For a brief moment the figure seemed to waver, its outline dissolving as the carefully arranged reflections were disrupted. And then, with a sudden clarity, the man himself stood revealed. Professor Adrian Voss. He was taller than I had expected, his frame thin, almost gaunt, his features sharp and composed. His eyes, which rested upon Holmes with quiet intensity, were those of a man accustomed to observing rather than being observed. "I had hoped," he said, "that you would remain concealed a little longer." Holmes's expression was calm. "I find," he replied, "that concealment is best reserved for those who depend upon it." Voss inclined his head slightly. "A fair observation," he said. Inspector Lestrade emerged at once, the constables at his side. "Adrian Voss," he said, "I arrest you." "On what charge?" Voss interrupted, his tone still composed. Lestrade hesitated for a fraction of a second. "For," he began. Holmes spoke quietly. "For conspiracy to commit grievous harm," he said, "and for the assault upon Mr. Halcombe." Voss's lips curved faintly. "Assault?" he said. "I have not laid a hand upon the man." Holmes's eyes did not leave his face. "You have done worse," he said. "You have sought to control the perceptions upon which action depends." Voss regarded him with interest. "A subtle distinction," he said, "but not one, I think, which the law will easily recognize." Lestrade stepped forward. "We'll let the courts decide that," he said. The constables moved to secure Voss, but he raised a hand slightly. "One moment," he said. There was something in his manner which caused even Lestrade to pause. Voss turned his gaze toward me. "Dr. Watson," he said, "you have been an admirable subject." I felt a tightening in my chest. "I am no subject of yours," I said. Voss's expression did not change. "On the contrary," he said, "you have demonstrated precisely the qualities I anticipated: loyalty, curiosity, and a commendable consistency of response." Holmes stepped between us slightly. "And what was the purpose of this demonstration?" he said. Voss's eyes returned to him. "To prove a principle," he said. "And that principle?" Holmes asked. Voss spoke calmly. "That perception, once shaped, may be relied upon to produce a predictable action or inaction at a critical moment." A silence fell. Holmes's voice was very quiet. "And that moment was to be?" he said. Voss's gaze flickered briefly toward me. "The moment at which Dr. Watson would fail to distinguish between appearance and reality," he said. I felt a sudden chill. "And then?" Holmes pressed. Voss's lips curved slightly. "Then," he said, "the experiment would be complete." Holmes's eyes hardened. "You intended more than an experiment," he said. "You intended more than an experiment," he said. Voss did not deny it. "Intention," he said, "is a matter of interpretation." Lestrade stepped forward again. "That's enough," he said. "You'll come with us." This time Voss did not resist. As he was taken into custody, he turned once more toward Holmes. "You have won, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but only because you understood the game." Holmes inclined his head. "And you lost," he said, "because you believed yourself its sole player." Voss gave a faint smile. "Perhaps," he said. When at last the door closed behind him, and the tension which had filled the room began to subside, I found myself drawing a long breath, as though emerging from some prolonged and unnatural strain. "It is over," I said. Holmes shook his head slightly. "It is concluded," he said, "which is not always the same thing." I looked at him. "You believe he would have gone further," I said. Holmes's expression was grave. "I am certain of it," he replied. A silence fell. "And yet," I said slowly, "his method, his control of perception, it was extraordinary." Holmes nodded. "Yes," he said, "and dangerous." He turned toward the mirror, regarding it thoughtfully. "The mind," he added, "is the most delicate of instruments. To tamper with it is to risk consequences beyond calculation." I followed his gaze. "And you would not employ such methods yourself," I said. Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward me. "I prefer," he said, "to deal in realities." Thus ended the case of the shadow. Or rather, thus ended the visible portion of it. For though Professor Voss was taken into custody, and though the apparatus by which he had achieved his effects was secured and examined, I could not entirely dismiss the impression that we had glimpsed only one aspect of a mind whose reach extended further than we might ever fully know. Yet of one thing I was certain: the shadow which had followed me, so persistent, so carefully constructed, had not been the product of chance or madness, but of a deliberate and highly intelligent design. And it was only through the insight and resolution of Sherlock Holmes that that design had been brought to light and, at last, to an end. In the days which followed the arrest of Professor Adrian Voss, a sense of calm gradually returned to Baker Street, though I would be less than candid were I to suggest that it came without effort. There are cases which conclude with a clarity so complete that they leave no lingering trace upon the mind. This was not among them. The circumstances we had witnessed, the subtle manipulation of perception, the deliberate shaping of thought, had impressed themselves too deeply to be dismissed at once. Holmes, however, resumed his customary habits with remarkable ease. On the morning after Voss's removal, I found him seated at the breakfast table, the newspapers spread before him, his attention divided between a column of parliamentary proceedings and the delicate adjustment of a chemical apparatus which occupied the corner of the room. There was in his manner no outward indication of the intensity through which we had so recently passed. "You appear untroubled," I said, taking my seat opposite him. Holmes glanced up. "On the contrary," he replied, "I am very much engaged." "With Voss?" I asked. Holmes folded the newspaper neatly. "With the implications of his method," he said. I poured myself a cup of coffee. "And you consider them significant?" I said. Holmes leaned back slightly, his long fingers steepled. "My dear Watson," he said, "any method by which the perceptions of a rational man may be influenced without his awareness must be regarded as significant." I could not dispute this. "He came very near to success," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Nearer than he himself perhaps realized," he replied. I looked at him sharply. "You believe I might have failed?" I said. Holmes's expression softened slightly. "I believe," he said, "that you were placed in a position designed to induce failure. That you did not fail is to your credit, but it does not diminish the ingenuity of the attempt." I was silent for a moment. "It is an uncomfortable thought," I said at last, "that one's own senses may be so directed." Holmes rose and crossed to the window. "Uncomfortable," he said, "but instructive." He paused, looking out into the street where the morning traffic had begun to gather. "The eye," he continued, "does not see merely what is before it. It sees what the mind prepares it to see. Alter that preparation, and you alter the result." I joined him. "And Voss understood this," I said. Holmes nodded. "Perfectly," he said. "He recognized that certainty is not an absolute condition, but a constructed one." A hansom cab passed below, its wheels rattling over the stones. "And yet," I said, "he failed." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Yes," he said, "because he overlooked one factor." "And that?" I asked. Holmes turned to me. "The presence of a second mind," he said, "observing the same conditions from a different perspective." I smiled slightly. "You refer to yourself," I said. Holmes returned the smile, though more faintly. "I refer," he said, "to the advantage of comparison. Where one man may be deceived, two may detect the inconsistency." I considered this. "And if he had directed his efforts at you?" I said. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "He would have found the task more difficult," he said, "but not impossible." This candid admission surprised me. "You believe yourself susceptible?" I said. Holmes gave a slight shrug. "To error?" "Certainly," he said. "To deception?" "Less so, but never beyond the bounds of possibility." There was something in his tone which suggested a deeper reflection than he chose to express. Inspector Lestrade called upon us later that afternoon, bringing with him the latest developments in the case. "Voss has been remanded," he said, settling himself in the chair Holmes indicated. "They're taking it very seriously." "I should hope so," I remarked. Lestrade nodded. "There's more," he said. "I should hope so," I remarked. Lestrade nodded. "There's more," he said. "We've examined the rooms he used, found all manner of contrivances. Mirrors, lenses, polished surfaces, some of them quite ingenious." Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "I should be interested to see them," he said. Lestrade chuckled. "I thought you might," he said. "Though I'll say this, clever as he was, he wouldn't have got far if not for that fellow Markham." "A necessary intermediary," Holmes said. "A visible agent to distract from the invisible hand." Lestrade leaned forward. "And what about the motive?" he said. "Revenge, you think?" Holmes glanced at me. "In part," he said, "but also demonstration." "Demonstration?" Lestrade repeated. Holmes nodded. "Voss was not content merely to act," he said. "He wished to prove to himself, if to no one else, that his theories could be applied under real conditions." Lestrade shook his head. "A dangerous sort of man," he said. "The most dangerous," Holmes replied, "is one who regards other men as subjects rather than equals." L'estrade rose. Well, he'll have plenty of time to reflect on that, he said. Good day to you both. Good day, Lestrade, Holmes said. When we were once more alone, I found my thoughts returning, as they had done repeatedly, to the final moments of the confrontation. There is one thing I do not fully understand, I said. Holmes looked up from his notes. Only one? He said lightly. I smiled faintly. One that I consider worth asking, I said. Why did Voss reveal himself? He might have remained concealed, continued his work through others. Holmes considered this. Because, he said, the final stage of his design required certainty. In what sense? I asked. Holmes set aside his papers. He needed to observe the result directly, he said, to witness the effect of his manipulation at the critical moment. And that moment was to be? I said. Holmes's gaze met mine. The instant at which you would have acted or failed to act under the influence of the illusion, he said. I felt a slight chill. And had you not intervened? I said. Holmes's expression was grave. I should have intervened, he said. But perhaps not before the result had been obtained. I studied him. You allowed it to proceed very far, I said. Holmes inclined his head. As far as was necessary, he replied. There was no boast in his tone, only a quiet certainty. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the familiar comfort of Baker Street settled once more around us, I found myself standing before the mirror in my room, the same mirror in which I had first seen the shadow. For some moments I regarded my own reflection. It appeared, as always, perfectly ordinary, unchanged by the events which had so recently disturbed it. Yet I could not wholly dismiss the memory of what had once appeared there so vivid, so convincing, and yet so entirely unreal. Holmes's voice came from behind me. You are testing it, he said. In a manner of speaking, I replied. Holmes approached and stood beside me, his eyes also upon the glass. And what do you conclude? He asked. That I shall not soon trust it again, I said. Holmes smiled faintly. On the contrary, he said, you will trust it precisely as much as it deserves. And that is? I asked. No more and no less, he replied. He turned away. The fault was never in the mirror, Watson, he added, only in the interpretation. I considered this. And yet, I said, the reflection remains. Holmes paused at the door. Yes, he said quietly, as do all reflections once seen. It is perhaps fitting that a case which began with a shadow should end with a reflection. For though the immediate danger had passed, the impression left behind was not so easily dispelled. I had learned in those few days something of the fragility of perception, and of the ease with which even a trained observer might be led astray under carefully arranged conditions. Yet I had learned something else as well, that in the presence of a mind such as Holmes's, a mind which seeks not merely to observe but to understand, such deceptions, however subtle, cannot long endure. And so, as I close this account of the case which I have ventured to entitle The Adventure of the Shadow That Followed Watson, I do so with a renewed appreciation not only of my friend's remarkable abilities, but of the delicate balance upon which all observation depends. For in the end it is not the eye that sees, but the mind that judges, and where that mind remains steady, no shadow, however artfully contrived, can prevail.